The first tremor felt like an earthquake. It wasn't an earth-shaking event, but the subtle thrum through the walls of the lab made everyone pause. Dr. Kate Adams was the first to notice, her eyes narrowing as the vibrations rattled the glass beakers on the counter. Her fingers danced over the interface of the device, fingers steady despite the gut-churning sensation of something wrong. Something was happening. Something big. "We're not getting the data we expected," she muttered to herself, her voice tight. "Something's off." The hum of the quantum resonance generator filled the room, a low, constant pulse that was now fluctuating, its energy output spiking on the screens before her. Behind her, the rest of the team was scrambling to make sense of the data, but none of them had the experience with this kind of anomaly. They'd been so confident that this was the moment they'd break through, the moment they unlocked the next step in quantum physics. Instead, it seemed like they had cracked open a door to something far darker. She flicked the emergency lever, trying to halt the experiment before it could escalate further, but nothing happened. The hum of the device only grew louder, its energy signatures spiking again in erratic bursts. "I'm trying to shut it down," Kate shouted to the team as she pounded the buttons. "We have to close it now." The room trembled, and then, with a violent crack, the lights flickered and died. The lab plunged into total darkness. A split second later, the air around them crackled with an intense static charge, and the generator began to glow with a strange violet light. Kate's pulse quickened. "We've done something wrong," muttered Leo, the lab's physicist, his voice betraying his own fear. "Something's happening. This isn't part of the experiment." The violet light pulsed, sending waves of cold air that cut through the room, as if the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in an instant. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling unnatural. Kate's breath hitched as she tried to access the backup controls, her hands trembling. Her gaze moved to the core of the machine. The energy fluctuations were off the chart, and then, with a sound like the sky tearing open, a low, reverberating hum filled the room, and the very air seemed to distort. A rift, an actual rift, appeared in the center of the room. Kate couldn't believe her eyes. It was like staring into an oil slick, all swirling, pulsating colors of purple, green, and blue. The edges of the rift twisted and folded in ways that defied all logic. "Shut it off!" Leo screamed, his voice high with panic. "What the hell did we do?" But it was already too late. The rift was widening rapidly, distorting the very fabric of reality. And then something began to emerge. A shape, no, a shadow, was creeping from the rift. It was a flickering, shifting mass, something that couldn't be described by the rules of this universe. It was as if it didn't belong here, its form constantly changing, bending, twisting as if it was still figuring out its place in the world. And then the scent hit her. Something metallic, burning, and bitter, a smell that made her stomach turn. Kate felt a wave of nausea hit her hard. Her breath quickened as the shape, now discernibly humanoid in some twisted sense, seemed to reach out of the rift, its limbs elongating like liquid smoke. It was as if it had no solid form, no true definition. The way it moved, undulating, creeping forward in an impossible way, made her spine chill. "Kate?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper, the fear evident. "Is that real? What is that?" The creature, if it could be called that, didn't answer. It just emerged from the rift like it was stepping into this reality from another dimension. The air grew heavy as its presence pressed in on them. Kate felt her skin prickle as the entity's form solidified, taking a more defined shape. It had no eyes, just empty, hollow sockets. Its body seemed to be comprised of interlocking geometric shapes, parts of its form folding into one another in unnatural ways. One of its arms extended toward the group, but instead of a hand, it opened up into a mass of jagged, shimmering metal, like a blade made of liquid steel. The rift pulsated behind it, and Kate felt the air around her grow oppressive. The lights flickered again, casting bizarre shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, twitching and jerking unnaturally. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. But there was no time. The creature lunged forward, its metallic blade slashing through the air with a terrifying screech. A shot rang out, and Kate turned just in time to see Leo stagger back, blood spurting from his side as the blade collided with his torso. His scream echoed through the lab, but it was cut off as the creature twisted its blade, pulling Leo's limp body toward the rift. His body jerked as though pulled by some invisible force, dragged toward the shimmering vortex. "No!" Kate shouted, reaching for him, but the creature's reach was impossibly fast. The jagged edge of its metallic appendage sliced through the air with horrific precision, the echo of Leo's scream fading into the vortex. Kate felt a cold rush of panic. "We have to get out of here!" she screamed at the others. She glanced toward the remaining members of the team, Eli, Hannah, and Raj, who had been frozen, terror-stricken, by the otherworldly creature's attack. But they were still staring at the rift, eyes wide with disbelief. Raj, the youngest of the team, was muttering under his breath in disbelief. "We opened it! We opened the door!" It wasn't a door. It was a portal, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. And now it was wide open, spilling something alien and horrific into their world. "We can't let it pull any more of us through," Kate shouted, grabbing Eli by the arm and dragging him back toward the emergency exit. The others were slow to react, paralyzed by the terror of what they had just unleashed. The creature's shape shifted again, morphing as though it were growing more solid. Its features were blending into one another, becoming more defined, more terrifying, like it was realizing its full form in this new universe. Its blade-like appendage still hung in the air, twitching, anticipating. But Kate was already moving. She shoved Eli toward the door, her pulse thundering in her ears as she glanced over her shoulder. The entity hadn't made any move to follow yet, but its presence was suffocating. The air seemed to crackle around them as if they were not in control of their own space anymore. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut behind them was the creature's shape, now almost human, staring at her with empty eyes, its silhouette blurred by the rippling energy from the rift. And as they ran down the sterile hallway of the lab, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had opened the door to something far worse than they ever imagined. And whatever that thing was, it wasn't the only thing waiting on the other side. Kate's heart was hammering in her chest as she bolted through the darkened corridors of the lab, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She could still hear the faint echo of the creature's scream, though it was distant now. It was the kind of sound that gnawed at her insides, a distorted and unnatural noise that haunted her thoughts. She could barely comprehend what had just happened, how the device they'd worked on for years had turned into a doorway to another universe, one that now seemed hostile beyond imagination. Eli was ahead of her, his face a mask of panic, his footsteps faltering with every passing second. The others, Raj and Hannah, were behind them, both of them still trying to process what had just unfolded. Kate's eyes were locked on the exit at the far end of the corridor, an escape route, a way out. But as they rounded the corner, her body froze, her mind screaming at her to stop, to look. At the far end of the hall, the door to the lab was wide open. The rift still hovered in the center of the room, its energy crackling and distorting the air around it. But it wasn't just the rift that caught her attention. It was what lay beyond it. There were shapes moving, no, things, hovering just inside the rift. They were dark, formless figures with limbs that stretched and folded in ways that made Kate's stomach churn. The rift was no longer just a tear. It had become a portal, pulling things through. The creatures, or whatever they were, seemed to be evolving as they moved toward the opening, as though they were adapting to this new universe. Kate swallowed hard, her instincts screaming at her to run. She glanced back at Eli, who had already started to backpedal, but it was too late. The door behind them slammed shut, and the air grew heavier, colder. The rift flickered, and then, as though it had a mind of its own, it pulsed with new life. The shadows inside it seemed to stretch and twist toward them, filling the hallway with an unnatural pressure. "Run!" Kate shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Kate's mind raced, trying to think of a way to stop what they had started, but there was no plan, no backup. It was just chaos. The rift had torn open something far worse than they had ever predicted, and there was no telling what horrors were pouring through. She glanced over her shoulder and caught sight of the creatures following them, no, chasing them, emerging from the rift with unnatural speed, their elongated forms slithering through the air like some kind of grotesque, multi-limbed nightmare. Their movements were fast, unnaturally fast. They seemed to glide through space, closing the distance between them with terrifying efficiency. "We need to get to the surface," Kate shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding feet. Eli nodded, his expression a mix of panic and determination. He was quick on his feet, but it was clear that their chances of outrunning the creatures were slim. The hallways of the lab stretched endlessly, their exits always just a little too far away. And with each passing second, the things from the rift grew closer. Kate turned another corner, nearly colliding with a steel door that led to an elevator shaft. The elevator, thank God, was still operational. It was their only chance. "Hurry!" she yelled, shoving open the door and diving into the elevator. Raj and Hannah stumbled in behind them, breathless. The moment the doors slid shut, Kate slammed her palm against the button for the surface. The elevator jerked into motion, but before it could even ascend, a horrible screech split the air, followed by a violent thud that reverberated through the elevator's walls. The door opened a crack, just enough for Kate to glimpse the nightmarish form of one of the creatures, its long, sinewy limbs reaching through the gap. Its body flickered in and out of focus, as though it were partially trapped between universes. "Close the damn doors!" Raj screamed, his face pale. Kate didn't need to be told twice. Her heart was pounding, her body trembling as she slammed her hand against the control panel. The doors slid shut with a grinding noise, and the creature's claw scraped against the metal, but the doors held. For now. The elevator shot upward with terrifying speed, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. Kate's breath came in shallow gasps as they ascended, the sound of the creatures screeching slowly fading. But that didn't mean they were safe. No, they were far from safe. "What the hell was that?" Hannah's voice shook. She was gripping the rail in the corner of the elevator, her knuckles white. "We opened the door," Raj said, his voice low, hollow. "And now they're here. All of them. From the other side." Kate's stomach twisted. She'd known it would be dangerous, but she hadn't imagined this. This wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This was a cosmic horror, something that had always been out of reach, beyond their understanding, and now it was here. And they had no idea how to stop it. The elevator jolted to a halt and the doors slid open. The surface level was empty, eerily so. No sounds of workers, no hustle or bustle. It was just the cold, sterile quiet of the facility. Kate led the way, her mind still racing as they made their way down the hallway to the surface entrance. But something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The world outside the lab seemed off. It was as though the fabric of reality itself had begun to unravel. The air was still, heavy, and the usual hum of the city had vanished. It was as if all of life had been sucked out of the world. "Something's not right," Kate murmured, glancing around. The city's skyline was visible through the windows, but the view seemed distorted, warped. The streets outside shimmered, bending unnaturally, as though the entire world was being viewed through a heat mirage. And then the ground shook again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just an earthquake or the vibrations of the rift. It was as if the very earth was groaning under the weight of something immense. "Get to the surface," Kate ordered, the urgency in her voice rising. But before they could move, the sky outside the windows tore open, ripping apart in jagged, ragged lines like paper, revealing the same violet glow of the rift that had opened in the lab. Out of the rift poured a flood of creatures, dozens, maybe hundreds, surging into the sky, their forms flickering and shifting as they descended like a storm of nightmares. The sound of their arrival was deafening, a cacophony of screeches and howls that set Kate's nerves on edge. And then the ground beneath their feet cracked. The rift had opened far wider than they could have imagined. It wasn't just a tear, it was an invasion. The first of many. Kate realized with a sickening twist of dread that this wasn't just the beginning of an experiment gone wrong. This was the beginning of something far worse. And they were stuck in the middle of it. The world outside had changed. Kate stood frozen, her gaze locked on the violet rift that was expanding in the sky, a blinding, unholy wound in the fabric of reality. From the rift, dark, shifting shapes continued to pour into the air, twisting and contorting into impossible forms. Some of them hovered, their bodies flickering in and out of existence, while others seemed to fall, their jagged limbs clawing toward the earth like grotesque parachutes. The sound was deafening. The shrill cries of the invaders pierced the air, an otherworldly screech that made Kate's skin crawl. The noise drowned out everything else. It felt as though her heart was beating in time with the eerie wails, each pulse matching the growing dread that gripped her chest. "We need to move. Now." Eli's voice was tight with fear, but there was a sharp urgency in it too. Kate didn't need any more convincing. The world around them was coming apart at the seams, and every second they hesitated was another second closer to being swallowed by the horror they had unleashed. "Raj, get the doors open!" Kate snapped, her voice urgent, though it trembled with fear. Raj was already at the door, his hands fumbling at the controls. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by raw panic. "The system's down. They've disabled everything. The lab's core it's corrupted. We can't access any external communications either. We're completely cut off. We don't need communications. We need a way out," Kate hissed, her mind racing. They had no idea what was happening outside the lab, what the creatures might do when they reached the ground. But whatever it was, she knew it wasn't going to be anything good. Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the door. "We can't stay here. Not with them coming. We need to get to the backup exit, to the maintenance tunnels." The maintenance tunnels. That was their only option now. The surface was no longer safe. Not with the sky torn open and the invaders swarming down, spreading out in an expanding cloud of death. "Come on!" Kate shouted, running in the direction Eli had pointed, her breath ragged in her throat. They didn't waste any time. It was only a matter of seconds before the creatures would reach them. The elevator shaft, now completely blocked, was out of the question. The only viable route left was the service access beneath the building. Kate's mind churned with thoughts of how to fight back, if there was any way to fight back, but each thought was quickly consumed by the images of the creatures. The bladed limbs, the shifting bodies that flickered in and out of their dimension, the inhuman shriek. There were too many of them. No weapons. No defense. Raj was ahead of her, and as she followed, Kate saw him glance over his shoulder, his expression one of pure terror. "They're here," he whispered. His voice was shaky, barely audible, as if speaking too loud would make the nightmare even more real. Kate's gaze snapped to the hallway behind them, her body tense. The dim lighting cast long, shifting shadows along the walls. For a brief moment it was silent, too silent, and then, a soft, almost imperceptible crackling sound, like the faint rustling of paper, echoed from behind them. Without thinking, Kate spun around, her hand reaching for the gun she knew she didn't have. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, dark and still. The crackling sound continued, growing louder. And then the walls, the very walls of the facility, began to warp. Not just bend, but stretch. The metallic surfaces rippled like liquid, distorting reality around them. It was the creatures. They weren't just appearing from the rift. They were pushing through, warping the world to accommodate their passage. "Move!" Kate shouted again, fear tightening her chest as she sprinted toward the service door at the end of the corridor. They were so close. She could see the maintenance access hatch just beyond the corner. But then, without warning, there was a loud crash, followed by a deafening roar. A creature, its body pulsating with shifting shapes, slammed into the hallway in front of them, its form exploding from the walls as though the very structure of the building had given way. Raj screamed. The creature was massive, its limbs like long, jagged appendages, covered in dark scales that seemed to ripple with unnatural energy. Its body shimmered, translucent, before it solidified into a grotesque, insect-like shape. The air around it bent, the edges of its form shimmering in and out of focus. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty black voids, endless and consuming. It shrieked, the sound reverberating through the walls. Kate had no time to think. Eli didn't hesitate. He lunged at the creature, pulling out a small utility blade from his pocket, slashing it in desperation. The blade barely made a dent in the creature's shifting form, but the monster recoiled, its body contorting as though confused by the attack. "Get out of the way!" Kate screamed, her pulse racing. She pushed past Eli, her hand finding the emergency control switch to the maintenance hatch. The door didn't budge at first, frozen shut. The rift outside, the portal, was affecting everything. The creature lunged at Eli, and Kate's heart dropped into her stomach as its massive arm shot out, slamming him into the floor. Eli screamed, but the sound was quickly muffled by the screeching roar of the creature as it raised its arm, preparing to strike again. Without thinking, Kate grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, yanking it off its mount. She hurled it toward the creature, and the explosion of foam and gas temporarily blinded it. The creature flailed and screeched, but it didn't stop. It didn't even seem to be injured. She pressed the button again. The door finally clicked and began to open. "Raj, Hannah, get in!" Kate shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. Raj and Hannah scrambled toward the hatch, their faces pale with terror. They dove into the tunnel entrance, disappearing into the shadows below. Kate hesitated for a split second, torn between leaving Eli behind or trying to pull him out of the creature's reach. Then, Eli's eyes met hers, bloodshot and frantic, his face covered in cuts and bruises. He wasn't going to make it. The creature was far too powerful, far too quick. "Go!" he screamed, his voice filled with raw desperation. Kate's chest tightened, her eyes burning with unshed tears, but she knew she couldn't save him. She turned away and leapt into the tunnel, her body hitting the cold metal stairs with a jarring thud. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy metallic clang. The last thing she heard as she descended into the depths was the creature's scream, the echo of her nightmare. The maintenance tunnels were dark, their damp, metallic walls closing in as Kate descended into the eerie quiet of the underground. The cold air in the tunnel made her shiver, the oppressive silence nearly suffocating. She could still hear the shrieking sounds of the creatures above, the world shattering as the rift above continued to tear reality apart. Kate didn't stop moving. The others were ahead, their panicked breath echoing down the narrow corridor. Raj and Hannah were silent now, their faces ghostly pale in the dim glow of their emergency lights. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Eli was gone. The thought hit Kate like a hammer, her heart sinking with each step she took, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. Not when they were being hunted by creatures from another universe, and the world above them was coming to pieces. "We need to keep moving," Kate said, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. She didn't care if they heard her. They were beyond the point of talking, beyond the point of trying to make sense of what had happened. The rupture between dimensions was growing, and with each passing moment, they were getting closer to being completely cut off from everything. Raj nodded silently, his eyes distant. Hannah was already moving ahead, her steps quicker than before, her breath shallow and ragged. They couldn't stay in the tunnels forever, they knew that. The creatures were coming, and if the rift continued to expand, there would be no escaping it. The tunnel twisted ahead, leading deeper into the facility's underground levels. Kate's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path, but it felt like the darkness was pressing in from all sides. Her mind raced. What if the rift's effects reached down here? What if it twisted this place too? The metallic air grew thicker with every step, the very atmosphere feeling unnatural. There was a strange hum, low and vibrating, coming from deep within the tunnels. Kate glanced at Raj and Hannah, who were both visibly unnerved by the sound. It wasn't just the rift anymore. Something was down here, something that felt wrong. "What is that?" Raj muttered, his voice low and full of dread. Hannah stopped dead in her tracks. "It's not just the rift. There's something else here." Kate paused, staring into the impenetrable dark ahead. The hum seemed to grow louder. It was a constant, throbbing vibration beneath their feet. It wasn't a natural sound, nor was it coming from the structure of the building itself. The air was thick with an unnatural charge, like the very fabric of reality was being warped, just like in the lab. "We need to keep going," Kate urged, though she felt a gnawing unease in the pit of her stomach. Something wasn't right. The rift was still their primary threat, but this new sensation, the hum, felt more ominous. It felt like they were walking straight into a trap. They pressed on. The tunnel eventually split into several passages, each one leading into a darker section of the facility. Kate led the group down the leftmost path, the one that appeared the least altered. But as they moved deeper, the walls began to shimmer faintly, ripples running through the metal like a glitch in a video game. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew stronger. It was as though the very tunnel was alive, reacting to their presence. The air pressure shifted again, this time pressing in on them from all sides, making it harder to breathe. The light flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Kate's pulse quickened. Then came the screech. It was a terrible, shrill sound that tore through the air, more intense than anything they'd heard above ground. It was almost human, yet distorted and alien, like the voice of a dying animal, twisted and stretched to its limits. The noise reverberated through the tunnel, rattling their teeth and bones. "Run!" Kate screamed, instinctively pulling Raj and Hannah forward, her feet carrying her faster than she thought possible. She didn't need to look behind her. She could already feel the creatures closing in, their presence swelling in the oppressive silence, like a storm gathering strength. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage as the screeching grew louder, more urgent, the creatures gaining on them. Behind them, the tunnel seemed to warp again, only this time, the walls were bleeding. The metal was melting, dripping like liquid, and where it pooled on the ground, strange shapes began to form. Like shadows stretching and pulling themselves from the walls, they twisted into grotesque, amorphous figures. Kate barely had time to process what she was seeing before something shot out from the wall, a black, tendril-like appendage, snatching at the air. It was almost too fast to follow, but she felt the brush of it against her ankle as she bolted forward. A sickening cold burned through her leg, and she nearly stumbled, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. They were almost there. The exit was within reach, just a few turns away, but the darkness in the tunnel was closing in fast. She could hear the creatures now, their screeches echoing off the walls, their multi-limbed forms crawling out of the shadows. The ground beneath her feet shuddered, cracking open as the creatures began to push their way through, breaking apart the world around them. Kate risked a glance over her shoulder, her heart sinking. The creatures had taken form now, their twisted limbs trailing behind them, their bodies flickering in and out of reality. They weren't just following anymore, they were hunting. Raj and Hannah were right behind her, but she could hear their breaths, ragged and desperate, as they struggled to keep up. Then, with a sudden crack, the tunnel ahead split, the floor buckling in a jagged line that made the very walls seem to collapse inward. The air thickened, almost choking them, as though something massive was forcing its way into this universe. Kate's heart raced. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't even fight them. There was nothing left but to keep moving. They ran through the collapsing tunnel, barely managing to stay ahead of the creatures closing in. And then, at the last possible second, a bright, blinding flash of light exploded ahead of them. It wasn't an explosion, but it might as well have been. The entire tunnel around them shifted violently as though reality itself had ruptured once more. The light intensified, expanding until it swallowed everything in its path. The creatures screamed. Kate felt herself being pulled toward the light, her body lifted from the ground as the gravitational pull of the universe itself seemed to break apart. The tunnel vanished, the rift expanding to consume them all. And then, all at once, everything went silent. Kate's eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the tunnel. The world around her had completely changed, distorted and alien, the sky an unnatural shade of violet, the landscape a twisted, broken version of what it once had been.